In the new age of consumer VR headsets and really high-resolution displays, I begin to wonder how much data does it take to actually fool the human eyes into thinking they're seeing a real image? If you ever tried a VR headset, chances are you know it's not a perfect experience. Of course it isn't. It's only just hitting the mainstream of consumerism, and the technology it just isn't quite there yet to satisfy our brains and fully suspend our disbelief. You usually see pixels on the screens, or things look blurry, or you can see black boxes at the edge of your vision. And to be fair, once you get used to it, it's a pretty good experience. But how much data is needed for it to be perfect? To begin attempting to answer this question, I have to establish a couple of concepts. First of all, how can we measure the data that's being inputted into your eyeballs? Well, data is measured in what are called bits. A bit is an integer data type that can essentially take a value of 0 or 1, on or off. The reason we store data in either one state or another is because it makes it easy to tell the computer what's going on. You see, computers speak a language known as electricity, and if you can tell a computer that something is having an electric charge, means it's a 1 or on, and that not having an electric charge means it's 0, then you can store data. Of course, in practicality, it's a lot more complicated than that, and our modern computers can store millions and millions of these little bits of information. All you really need to know for the purposes of this video is that data can be stored in bits, which we've already talked about, and that those bits are usually arranged in arrays of 8, called bytes, which you've likely heard of because it's usually the minimum size a file can take in our current operating systems. Also, thousands of those bytes are called kilobytes, thousands of those are called megabytes, and thousands of those are called gigabytes, etc. My point is you've likely heard some of these terms. Okay, so we have a unit of measurement. How the hell do we quantify just how many bits or bytes or whatever we need to fool the human eyes? Well, actually first we need to refine our measurement to a metric that makes sense. You see, bits and bytes and stuff like that are stationary. You could measure a photo in bits, or you could even measure a video in bits, so long as it has a finite length. But human eyes just keep going. So we need a measurement that goes along with them and constantly measures the amount of data that's going in. To do this, we add time to the equation, and we get what is called a bit rate. Common forms of bit rates include kilobits per second or megabits per second. You might have done an internet speed test at some point in your lifetime and seen a value in bits per second. It's actually a fairly common data measurement. For context, songs you play back on your phone usually have a bit rate of 128 or 256 kilobit per second. H.264 1080p 60 MP4 video, or what you're watching right now, has a bitrate between 3 to 12 megabit per second. Pretty much any data stream has a bitrate because it's a certain amount of data streaming into your eyeballs or ear holes or whatever every second. So just how much data do you need to fool the human eyes? Well, for the purposes of this video, let's imagine you have a screen and some kind of lens that allows your entire eye to be perceiving the image. I could get into specifics about how this is not quite possible due to the limits of modern technology, but we're pretty much there. The question then becomes, how high of a resolution does that screen, or screens, because there's one for each eye, need to be? Well, if you've ever looked closely at a larger display, such as a monitor or television, you can likely see pixels in the image, which is what we're trying to avoid. But if you've ever looked closely at your phone screen or a smaller display, it's likely harder to see the pixels. This is because of pixel density. Quite simply, if you have a larger display with the same amount of pixels as a smaller display, then the pixels need to be further apart to fill the dimensions of the display. But there's still the same amount of pixels on both. So if we are indeed putting a display in front of our eyes, the pixels are pretty densely packed, therefore we won't need as high a resolution to display a crisp image. But just how high resolution does it need to be? Well, According to Wikipedia, the virtual reality headset on the market today with the highest PPD, or pixels per degree value, which is a measure of pixel density, is the Pimax 8K, with a PPD of 22.58. However, there are actually pixel densities that get higher than that. The Varjo VR2 reaches an astonishing PPD of 60, but it only maintains that pixel density in the middle of the screen, and the outer edges are 16.55, which is still pretty high. The reason the Varjo gets away with only putting high pixel density in the center of the screen is because the human eye actually only sees sharp detail within 6 degrees of the center of its focus. So this is a brilliant way to save on data throughput. However, if the imaginary bitrate for human sight is going to have absolutely no compromises and completely suspend your disbelief, then we need to have the pixel density consistent across the entire range of motion for your eyeballs so that moving your pupils around doesn't compromise on quality. Varjo's website claims that 60 ppd is human eye resolution, so I'm going to go out on a limb and trust them on that, accepting that as the necessary minimum density of pixels. So we've got one piece of the puzzle, which is pixel density of the screen. If we were to say, for the sake of simplifying things, that the field of view for each eye is 120 degrees, which is the full field of view of the human eye, now we can calculate the PPD by dividing the horizontal resolution of the screen by the horizontal field of view. We have 2 of those components, so some simple algebra will get us a horizontal resolution of 7200 pixels. That's pretty darn close to 8K, so for the sake of ease, I'm just going to go with dual 8K screens. That is a lot of pixels. For context, an 8K screen is 4 4K screens, or 16 1080p screens. Yikes. Let's go back to talking about bit rates for a second. Have you ever used an HDMI cable? It's likely. They're the most common display connector right now, and you'll find them all over common televisions and computer monitors. HDMI actually has different versions of the cable that are capable of carrying different bit rates. The newest version of HDMI, as of writing this video, is HDMI 2.1, which has been around since 2017 and is capable of 48 gigabit per second speeds. That's 48 billion bits every second. This cable could only drive one of the 8K monitors in front of your eyes at a frame rate of only 30 frames per second. Now, technically, under the confines of that 48 gigabit per second speed, we can run the frame rate higher and achieve as much as 60 frames per second. But A, that's still not enough frame rate to satisfy the eyes, and more importantly, B, this is at the cost of color depth. Color depth is the amount of colors that can be accurately recreated using a single pixel in an image, and when I said that an HDMI 2.1 cable can run at 8K resolution and 30 frames per second, I meant that it can run that while maintaining 48 bits of color depth. We absolutely need 48 bits of color depth because it's the maximum color depth that we can have, and obviously if we were to fool the human eyes, colors need to look perfect. So in other words, HDMI 2.1 doesn't have a high enough bit rate to support even one human eye's vision requirements. So with that out of the way, let's talk about frame rates. A frame rate is the speed at which a monitor or television can refresh and display a new frame. So the aforementioned 30 frames per second means that you would see 30 individual pictures in a second of vision. It turns out that this rate is a lot slower than the speed at which human eyes see things. It's generally agreed upon that humans can't see any differences in the frame rate above 90 frames per second, so I'll set the frame rate we need for this experiment at 90 frames per second. Most VR headsets also run at this frame rate. With this metric in mind, let's talk numbers. The 48 gigabit per second bit rate I talked about earlier is capable of supporting one eye, or one screen, at 8K resolution and 30 frames per second with full color depth. This means that if I multiply that number by 3, I get the bit rate required to provide full color depth 8K at 90 frames per second, 144 gigabit per second. But of course, there are 2 eyeballs to worry about, so the actual bit rate for human sight is 288 gigabit per second. Except it's not that simple. Unfortunately, a little thing called dynamic range is involved in the equation. Have you ever heard the term HDR thrown around when talking about new televisions? That acronym stands for High Dynamic Range. Dynamic range is the ratio between the maximum and minimum measurable light values. It's essentially the difference between a photo like this and a photo like this. In the left photo, you can't really see the sky. It's all washed out and there's not much detail. Same thing with the dark dress the woman on the right is wearing. However, in the photo on the right, you can see a lot more detail in all different areas of the photo, and that's because the camera has more dynamic range, meaning it can measure higher light values more accurately, and the same with lower light values. How does this all apply to human sight? Well, a good HDR screen nowadays hopefully displays video at 13 stops of dynamic range, or a ratio of 2 to the power of 13 to 1. The human eye is capable of dilating back and forth and therefore has a variable dynamic range which at its peak can span to about 24 stops of dynamic range, or a ratio of 2 to the power of 24 to 1. So let's adjust the previous total of 288 gigabit per second to encompass a typical HDR TV's dynamic range, 346 gigabit per second. Okay, not too bad, right? Well, actually, since the dynamic range is on an exponential scale, the dynamic range of the human eye is actually 2,048 times larger than the dynamic range of the HDR television. Meaning, the actual bitrate of human sight, as far as I can calculate it, is 691.2 terabit per second. For context, that bitrate is the equivalent of 14,745 HDMI 2.1 cables. I sort of doubt you could plug that many cables into a VR headset and still comfortably play VR. In fact, the world's fastest network, aka the world's fastest transfer speed, is only capable of 255 terabit per second, meaning the human sight can't even be transmitted on the fastest network that the human race has developed so far without making sacrifices to quality. That's just how special our human eyes are. Oh hey, thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. I appreciate it. This one actually took me a long time. I spent about 2 weeks animating this one, and I'm pretty proud of how it came out. So I appreciate you taking the time to watch it. You should leave a comment down there telling me what you thought of it and what you'd like to see in the future. And all that other stuff. Subscribe, like, whatever. You know how YouTube works. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you.